Do what thou will be the whole piece of law.
I'm looking at you. Yes, you. Have you ever wanted unlimited wealth and power? Have you ever wanted to be able to change the way you look at women? Did you know that all those posters that white women have all over their houses actually mean something? Try Neville Goddard's Law of Assumption today. Stay tuned for details. So if that sounds interesting to you, you may be the target audience of all of these AI-generated videos about Neville Goddard, and you possibly attend the thread on X. So if you're like me and you came across this for the first time, and you saw Law of Assumption, I didn't know what that meant, and I was a little confused. So mainly I'm making this for people who want to know who Neville Goddard is, and what the Law of Assumption is, and what its quote-unquote powers might be, as some people are annoyingly persistent about it, and it may actually give you some insight onto why people keep those posters and sayings about their house. But before we start, you need to know that my ad campaign doesn't come for free, because the big shot that I am with my most recent video got me to advertise. So please like, comment, subscribe. I can't do a Spamton impression. I've never played the game. But anyway, now that my ad campaign is over, let's get into the real meat and potatoes of Neville Goddard, as I promise you it's a little more interesting, especially if you're a big fan of religion. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with the basics. Neville Goddard was born on the island of Barbados, a little island in the Caribbean, south of the United States, on February 19th, 1905. This would make him a British citizen at this point in time, as, you know, the wonders of colonialism. He was of British descent and the middle child of a large family. I'm talking 9 boys and a girl. This really sucked to be the one girl. And being a middle child, he came prepackaged with all the angst and love of music, arts, and religion, obviously having no one to guide him because his parents weren't going to do it. He grew up and moved to the United States, where in New York City, he picked up a tutor from what was at that time called the Threefold Movement, which we'll get into in a second, by the name of Abdullah. Now, many people will try and convince you that Abdullah was one person or another, but the people over at the reliable source of Cool Wisdom Books have done a lot of diving into Neville Goddard, and I'm pretty convinced by their assumptions. Title drop. And apparently, Cool Wisdom Books likes to say that this was a man named Abdallah Guillaume, who was a baritone tutor, and they like to disregard Neville Goddard's claims sometimes that he was over 115 years old sometimes, because Goddard himself has a track record of never being able to know people's ages correctly. It's like when I go up to people on the street and I'm like, oh, you look really young. And they're like, yeah, I'm like 50. I always misjudge people as way younger than they are, which I guess is a good problem to have if you want people to like you. But Neville Goddard's the exact opposite. He'll walk up to someone who's like 50, allegedly, and say like, yeah, you're like 115. But I guess that just adds to the mystique. Who knows? But what's more important, rather than who this tutor is or how old he was, is the ideas that Goddard would get from him, which I'm gonna ask you to put a pin in because I want to go into the spiritual analysis at the very end when we try and put the massive concept together along with everything else. This is just his basic biography. Now, the Threefold Movement, literary-wise, is pretty scarce when it comes to sources. It's a sum total of less than 100 pages that surprisingly can be found on the UN Archives Geneva of all places. But the Threefold Movement was the culmination in a line of organizations, which were the Union of East and West in 1921, the League of Neighbors in 1922, and the Fellowship of Faiths in 1924, would all unite to become what was colloquially known as the Threefold Movement in 1924. And all of these spawned from the idea that the Parliament of Religion set forth in the first Chicago World's Fair in 1893. So, just to make it simple about what they believe, they are the hippie movement before the hippie movement in the 60s, minus the substance use. It was a group committed to unify cultures and governments, religions and ideas, to create one unified human culture, emphasizing humanism and forwarding a progressive political platform. Especially for the day, this isn't just progressive now, but of course, this organization still exists today and follow the progressive platform of what you would imagine it is. But back in this time, when colonialism was still cool, racism was still in practice to a greater degree than it is now, and a massive world war had just been fought over the idea of multipolar worlds in Maine and I'm not getting into the First World War over this tiny organization, but they were progressive. They were anti-colonialist, anti-racist, and at this time wanted to have all the religions of the world come together in a massive congress. They even had a prayer called the Universal Prayer that they use as a glue to hold all of these religions together. And very simply, they strived for egalitarianism and equality over everything else, but I don't want to get lost in the weeds more than I already have. But just keep these ideas in mind for what Goddard is picking up over time, through his tutor no less. And based on what I've told you already, it sounds like Goddard is very spiritual, very adept in religion and religious practices, which, from this tutor, besides the influences of the threefold movement, he also got taught esoteric Judaism, Christianity, and Kabbalah by his tutor. He also picked up the study of Hebrew and ancient Greek at this time. However, I want to save the significance of this for later, but just know that it's there. Put another pin in it. We'll get there, I promise. He also got introduced to another tutor, which once again is just as questionable, because he says it's an old Scotsman by the name of Arthur Begbie. But here's the twist. He isn't even a real person acknowledged by the historical record. Once again, Cool Wisdom Books doing the real digging says there's like 3 possible people who it could be, and why it is that Goddard meets all these weird esoteric people who he'll give weird names and nobody knows who they are is still a mystery in and of itself. But the best guess that the amazing source of Cool Wisdom Books will tell you is Arthur Findlay, due to his capacity to just throw out books, and there was a typo in a newspaper about how Arthur Findlay one time was referred to as Arthur Begbie in an unrelated article, but once again, this is going far too into the weeds because I kind of want to stick to near Neville Goddard. I'm tempted to just stick with the Arthur Findlay assumption, but who knows? Nobody will ever know who Arthur Begbie is, and it's another one of those, yeah, Goddard calls him like 90 years old, but he was actually only around 50 at this time, so maybe Goddard just had a really good skincare routine and kept himself looking plasticky all the time, because all the photos you see of him, he's like immaculately cared for, even though he's like 60 in all the photos that are taken of him. But anyway, this Arthur Begbie, no matter who he is, taught him the art of the seance, not just for spirits, but for internal alignment and reorganization. So once again, put a pin in that. When the Great Depression began to set in 1929, he started studying more general mysticism, but he never truly divorced from the base Bible teachings. Keep in mind that he's always keeping the Bible as the baseline for all of his thoughts. He never really strays from this, even though he was taught esoteric interpretations, which will be apparent in a second. That's another thing you're gonna have to put a pin in it. I hope my corkboard doesn't fall off the wall. Just kidding, it's covered in fiberglass. But anyway, 2 years later, in 1931, Goddard had a stint with the Rosicrucian Fellowship as a guest lecturer. Now, a man peddling faith, as everyone was struggling to survive, is certainly a career path to pick, but I mean, he was doing dance and opera before this, so I mean, you gotta do a career pivot sometime somehow, so everyone's gotta eat. Now, in reference to the Rosicrucian Fellowship, I'm not gonna go over the history of the organization, because really only the teachings of this order are the most important for understanding Goddard. Now, this isn't going to be a complete outline, but this is going to be the most important general concepts to keep in mind when Goddard is formulating his ideas and going to all these lectures. And it must be said that Goddard must have pulled more from the ideas than the people of the Rosicrucian order, because he got scammed by one of their members in this time, as he apparently bought fake stocks from a person within the order, and after he died, Goddard said, well, he was about 200 pounds when he died, and I'm not a very strong man, and I could only trust him as far as I can throw him, which wasn't very far, because I bought stocks from him, and I never got them, so it seems like he didn't care for the people, and this was more of a networking opportunity for Neville Goddard. But anyway, the Rosicrucian order, or if you want to translate it, the Order of the Rose Cross, or the Rose-Laden Cross, or the Rosy Cross, would give Goddard a definable toolkit to start dissecting his knowledge of the Bible, namely what the Rosicrucian order would call the path of the mystic, and their personal definition of mysticism, which the definition of mysticism is the art of knowing while transcending nature in a very simplistic way, and the path of the mystic being defined as the evolution of the self. It's a version of self-cultivation through spiritual and physical knowledge about oneself. Finding all the answers within yourself as you meditate or study God or the Bible. It's a simple concept, but to Rosicrucians, this is a path you will be walking an entirety of your life. I also got like vague Scientology vibes, but minus the aliens. It's as if you took the Bible and slotted it into Scientology rather than a science fiction novel, but that's conjecture. However, all the inner development, discovery, and esoteric religious practices would take a backseat when Goddard was surprisingly drafted in 1942 after Pearl Harbor and did a brief stint in the Army. He served in a tank battalion for less than a year, but this gave him his U.S. citizenship. He had been living throughout the United States at this point, in San Francisco and New York City, namely. However, he still was a British citizen, so this allowed him to stay in the country permanently, and after this, he would begin to go on lecture tours espousing his knowledge, and would later get his own TV show that is what I imagined public television would look like when I was 5, as if you want a really nice lost media opportunity, this TV show, which aired sometime in the 1950s to 60s, was called Neville. Very creative name. But this TV show was recorded when magnetic tapes were just becoming a big thing. You know, VHS, that's a magnetic tape. And this TV show, Neville, was recorded on these magnetic tapes and then aired on a small TV station called KTTV. However, no known recording of this show exists. We only have audio because the magnetic tapes of the time could only record videos, and these were very expensive. So, after the TV show was aired a couple times, they would re-record over the magnetic tape because these are very expensive investments. They can't just keep them in stacks like they used to when it was very cheap and inexpensive. This is the breaking cutting edge of technology, and they need these as large investments. So, we have all the audio, because that was recorded on the very cheap stuff they could throw in the back and forget about, but the video is lost. This is another thing when I was trying to research the video, is when I was looking, I found how much AI slop there is on Neville Goddard, because apparently this is a really big thing that I didn't know that people cared about. There's so much AI generated content, like Neville Goddard has been run through so many AI algorithms that his voice has been used to read his own books, which is equal parts impressive and terrifying. But hearing him speak, I can see why so many people like him, and it got me to like him a lot more. But anyway, this wasn't his only TV appearance. He would also go on to novel talk shows like The Joe Pine Show and do theological debates with other pastors and ministers, where he could recite the Bible in English, Hebrew, and Greek from memory. This is some serious debate power. You know the game Bible Man? When, back in the old days of YouTube, that really awful game, I don't know why it's stuck in my head, I've never played it, but I watched one review and it's stuck in my head. You know Bible Man? That's Neville Goddard, just running around being able to recite Bible verses in 3 different languages. I guess it's the only thing they had to do in the 1920s when he was growing up. But that's about where Neville's story ends. A very basic biographical overview, as he would die from an esophageal rupture in 1972. However, that's Neville Goddard as a person. I want to talk about Neville Goddard the man versus Neville Goddard the concept. What was he actually debating, lecturing, and writing about that people cared about? Well, this is where all those pins will fall out of the corkboard and I can start putting the pieces of paper that I've been assembling through the entire video onto the floor, and we can get a concrete idea of what the law of assumption is. As if you ever see Neville Goddard, this is probably going to be the thing you see associated with his name. The law of assumption, at its very base, is that you can become what you imagine yourself to be. Well, that's very boring, and it really strips the idea of what Neville Goddard wanted and identified with the law of assumption, because he has an episode of his TV show that's been recovered explaining what the law of assumption is. Now, I won't bore you with making you sit through all the Neville Goddard quotes, but I want to start putting together the origins of what this came from and possibly elaborate on how you could take it further if you wanted to. Now, let's start with the base. First, remember how I said that Goddard studied esoteric Bible study and the Kabbalah underneath his tutor Abdullah? Well, this becomes the spiritual binder for the biblical emulsion that will produce the law of assumption. The law of assumption is not an atheistic concept. it requires you to have these baselines. So if you're not prepared to subscribe to that, subscribe to me instead. Anyway, the Kabbalah gives humanity a central focus in creation, especially in what Goddard would study, as he was introduced to a key concept called the Harmonia Mundi, or described more precisely as the harmony of creation between God and man. Now, this is elaborated upon in the Kabbalah's two divine aspects, being the concealed and the revealed God, which Goddard likes to try and blend together and make into a pseudo-Venn diagram to humanity. The hidden is a limitless well of power that you can draw from, and the revealed is how this power relates to and sustains humanity. Now, you may already see where I'm going with this, but hold on, because Goddard did not build this in a day, so be patient. Taking this even further, this relates to the Harmonia Mundi and the Adam Kadmon. Now, if you are a Persona 5 fan, you already know what that means, but it's not the same. The Adam Kadmon is the original human, the divine aspect of humanity, the originality of Adam. Now, this relation to Adam Kadmon is an empty vessel. It is the epitome of potential. It is something waiting to be utilized. And this Harmonia Mundi, Goddard would take with the concept of the Adam Kadmon and the manifested and concealed gods to begin to create humanity as a vessel for itself. Now, if that doesn't make sense, it will in a moment as I begin to explain further. Goddard, with his brief stint in the Rosicrucian Fellowship, also picked up the concept of the inner Christ and the cultivation of the soul body and ideal self. Now, the Rosicrucians have 13 bodies and a bunch of different layers to their selves, but the soul body is the most important. Bringing these in further with the concepts of self-cultivation, you begin to manifest the idea of a human shell with God inside and about, and the Rosicrucian idea of self-cultivation, bringing that to being. And what seals this all together is his study of Hebrew, the language. Now, it may not seem important right now why this is important, but in Goddard's Law of Assumption TV show episode, he translates the name of God, which has been translated multiple ways. He acknowledges that, Jehovah, the Lord, the Father, but he says these are all incorrect, as Goddard would translate it as to I am. Now, this seals everything together. God being the person inhabiting this empty shell, the Adam Kadmon, bringing forth the harmony of creation, the Harmonia Mundi, bringing the concepts of the concealed and the revealed God together, leaves this shell with a self-cultivating inner God in the middle, the soul body that inhabits the shell, with the God in the interior. Now, when Goddard translates this to I am, he names the inner God as your imagination. Now, to reiterate, the Law of Assumption is as Christian as the Rosicrucians, namely with Goddard being so adept with Bible passages, which, for example, he uses the chapter 32 of Deuteronomy to prove perception becomes reality. He uses many Bible verses that he can quote from memory to back up his claims in his lectures. It is founded concretely in the belief in God, and Goddard always wants you to stay internally focusing on that Rosicrucian self-cultivation. Because when you say God the Father, God or Jesus or the Lord or any of these things, you are thinking of something external, something other than yourself. In a way, you are surrendering yourself to an external force, which Goddard is not about. He has a quote that says, "It's so much easier to blame someone other than self for the things that are happening to him." And I think that sums it up perfectly. He's all about accountability. He's a very can-do person, because when you say imagination, you think of the internal. But when you say God, the Father, Jesus, you are surrendering to an external force. External versus internal. He wants you to focus on the internal. That's where all the change happens. He also proclaims that imagination is the true God, the internal God, and this is the translation for potters in the Bible. He focuses inordinately on the potters, and it is understandable why. The potters are those who mold things to their will. They can do basically anything as long as they have clay. It makes sense that the translation that he would go with for potters is imagination. You can sculpt yourself, this idea of self-sculpting, self-cultivation with divine power. He also then gets a little cult-like, I'm going to say, because he goes on a tangent saying that most average people have these malleable minds that will change based on various stimuli. It's the look down the nose of their thoughts change, they're so reactive. They have these malleable minds and their thoughts change often. But he says if you can hold one belief with all of your mental fortitude, despite what reason may say, if you can hold on to one belief with all of your mental fortitude and get over the hurdle of reason, then you can invoke the power of God to make it into an objective reality. So, in more simple terms, if you can gaslight yourself so hard as to believe that what you imagine yourself to be is true, then it will become true. Now, he will elaborate on why this is in a second, but just know that that is the simple foundation of the law of assumption. Now, this is just as bad as it is good, as Goddard in his example recounts how when his father was being shipped home from the war, they were already talking and assuming that a second world war would already happen, and his father basically predicted it down to the letter, but this could also be Goddard backdating, because this show happened in the 60s, and World War II ended in 1945, so attribute this to whether Goddard's law of assumption is so powerful to manifest another world war, or this is just him trying to reinforce his idea that doesn't mean anything. I'll leave it up to you. But he states that World War II was just everyone's assumption that another would happen. Now, on a personal level, you know those really cringe posts you used to see back in 2012 about, like, whenever you say something bad about yourself, your inner samurai dies or something like that? That is the law of assumption working in reverse. If you constantly assume that you are someone unworthy of love or attention, or, oh, I'm so fat, or I'm so gross, and you just keep saying that over and over and over again, your body will internalize it, and you will begin to activate the law of assumption parentheses bad, where you eventually just lock yourself into what you assume you can do. But if you want to attempt this yourself, how would you do it? Goddard focuses on what people call the promise, which is, as an example, let's say your goal was, I want to become a successful internet personality. Shooting a little too close to home, but let's hope it works. Goddard says that this is the promise, which is, before anything becomes objective reality, it must be promised and thought of first, which means you can't start from zero. You can't become something you don't know what you want to be. Very simple and very logical. He says, just as any invention was made real, it was first imagined. Right? The monitor or cell phone you're watching this on was not real before someone came up with it. Therefore, when imagining, you do not have to be rational, you just need to imagine wholeheartedly that you are, and the rest will follow. If you imagine that you are a successful internet personality with millions of subscribers and billions of loving fans, it will happen. You just need to ignore the fact that your channel is sitting at less than 1,000 subscribers and your most successful video got about 4,000 views. Ignore that reality. Keep persisting, keep going, and don't stop no matter what reality tells you, no matter what the malleable minds may say. If you concretely believe that this will come to pass, it will. And the same goes for negativity. If you say, for example, oh, I'm so fat, I'm disgusting, all I do is I sit in my room and I do nothing all day, then it will come to pass. You imagine yourself as someone who stays in the same place and does nothing all day for various reasons you will use to justify yourself, but that's the enemy of your imagination. You're not believing what you truly can be. You're limiting yourself. You're keeping yourself bound by rationality. If you just discard rationality, anything becomes possible, in Goddard's view at least. There's also an underlying layer of hypnotism and suggestion, because he uses the words dream and imagine interchangeably, and he seems to give dreams the significance of being an addition to the molding of the imagination rather than an extension, which is to say, you imagine what you want to be. That's the promise. You start off with the promise. And you can dream about these things, aka while you're asleep, you can dream about these things, and this is like the super glue that begins to hold the parts together, or the nails that will build your staircase to whatever you want to be, rather than just trying to construct it out of wood alone. But I could also be wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong. I have promised to myself that I am never wrong, which means that's the law of assumption at its core. If you ever wanted to make it work for yourself, let me know. I'm genuinely curious. I've been quote-unquote practicing the law of assumption for a a while, but most people do it unconsciously. But when you become aware of it, it becomes a lot easier to do. Or you could call it a bunch of hogwash and never use it in your life. All I care about your watch time. No. I was vaguely paying attention to some of the audio of his old TV episodes, and I got thinking that I had kind of already been doing this. And when he said that quote, "It's so much easier to blame someone other than the self for the things that are happening to him." And I got it. I understood why I was so entranced by Neville Goddard when I was learning about him. He's just the Christian Ayn Rand, right? Everything's within your reach because I am God. That's Goddard's view. Everything is within your reach because I am God. Ayn Rand wanted to tear down God and traditional religion and replace it with man, but I don't think it's the Goddards throwing their hats too high when Goddard said, "I am God," and so he was. Wow. I don't know why I had so much more energy during that one. It's crazy. But anyway, I would assume that if you made it this far, you enjoy what I have to say, or you just enjoy my content style as a whole. So, I would kindly ask you once again to like, comment, and subscribe, as I've already assumed that you would. But it must also be said that in this little bit of a postscript, that the law of assumption does have its limits. Going to influencing other people is a little less. You can influence yourself to become influential to other people, but you can't imagine that someone else will just miraculously obey you, and they will. This is self-sculpting self-cultivation, which it's human to want to improve, and Goddard found a way to do that within a Christian mold. So if that appeals to you, go for it. I mean, there's really no harm, unless you end up creating a Pinkie Pie tulpa, but you'd have to imagine that you wanted that in the first place. Ooh, maybe I should do a video on tulpas. We'll see. But I really do want to thank you for watching. It means the world to me, and if this video does as half as well as my previous one did, I will be unimaginably happy. So, just as a reminder before you go, you can always gaslight yourself into being what you want to be. If your flame's going out, just add more gas.